Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. Thank you so much for pulling up a chair and for supporting this venture between myself, Fernando Arencibia Jr., and my co-host and amazing commercial agent, broker, expert. You know, the list goes on and on, Jennifer Woolman. Jennifer, say hi.
I just love watching him work himself into pretzels, trying to find new words to describe me every time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Between Two Chairs.
So, Jennifer, I understand we're going to dive into something that is hyper-specific and has to do with commercial leasing. So, would you share with everybody what is your, what is the topic du jour? Look at that, I'm speaking French and everything.
Getting ready for the Paris Olympics, I guess. I can say French fry.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about two clauses that are, one is common in leases and one is not so common, but we feel like is important. So the common one is the personal guarantee.
Right.
And the not so common is the early termination clause. So I thought we could discuss those because given today's market and what we've been seeing, there is a lot more lease activity going on with people needing to get into leases or get out of leases and wait, just because there's not as much deal flow on the transaction in terms of sales and investment side. We're seeing a lot more leases being done. So I thought that was something important to bring to our members' attention. Yeah. And the reason the personal guarantee is always in a lease is because it's putting somebody, it's the landlord saying, hey, even though this is leased to a company, I want to know who is personally going to be responsible for paying this if you break the lease early or whatever.
I like this topic because I think sometimes it can be the one thing that derails a deal, especially if you are leasing your first, retail location, for example. And I'm going to pick retail because usually if, for example, if you're a food and beverage business and you started mobile, right? Mm-hmm. And now you're going to go into your first brick and mortar store, right? And there is an incredible cost to that build out and to setting up, shop. Obviously, we know that the restaurant industry is a precarious industry, right? There's a high success of failure. So people always concern themselves with this idea that I'm going to personally guarantee, this lease for a certain number of times. And there are ways to go about it, which we will discuss during this episode. But I think it's important to consider that it's important to have that conversation early, especially if it is a business that is going to lease space for the first time. Don't you think?
Yes, and that's part of the, I guess, landlord's protection, right? Is that landlords are also in the business of making money and they want their tenants to succeed because they want their spaces to remain leased and everything else. So that's one of the reasons.
Sure. Let me ask you a question, because what I have found has been, especially businesses that are in their early stages, when we have a discussion about a personal guarantee, what always trips them up is that the personal guarantee that the landlord is asking for is not only for the owner of the business, but it's for their spouse to also personally guarantee the lease. Have you found that that is the biggest obstacle in having that conversation? Because a lot of people feel, well, I'm the owner of the business. Why does my spouse have to sign a personal guarantee?
Right. Well, I've seen both. I've seen some where the spouse doesn't have to sign, but then it states, and I'm going to read one that I have in front of me. It says that the principal or member of such company on behalf of himself and his heirs personally guarantees to the landlord and successors and assigns the full performance, and that is passed on to anybody else who comes in. So if something were to happen to the guarantor, that means his estate becomes liable, or his heirs and the people still behind him are liable. Now, we're not lawyers, we're not attorneys, we're not playing one here on the podcast. We're literally just reading out of existing leases that were drafted up by either our landlords, or presented to our tenants. And again, it's just to make you aware that it's fairly common. Yeah. It is scary because you are saying that you're personally, even though you might set up an LLC, which shields you from some types of liabilities, it doesn't from having to fulfill the lease agreement. So there are ways to minimize that. Something could be as easy as just crossing it off, right? You can just cross it out and say, well, no, I'm not going to do a personal guarantee. You might be able to convince them that you can put up an additional deposit or put a little bit of money aside for X number of months should you default after a certain period of time. So there are ways to work it. Obviously, if you are a big company with good financials, those personal guarantees don't come into play, but they are in the lease anyway, so you better make sure that they're struck out. And you can also do, I call it a step-down lease, but I think it's more formally called, a step-down guarantee, but it's more formally, I think, called a burn-off or burn-out clause, where you can step it down and you can say, okay, I'll do the personal guarantee up to a certain period of time, but once I've reached that time, that guarantee goes away. And you keep my security or whatever it is. So there are ways to work around it is what I want.
So I'll tell you that I had a client, we were having a conversation. They were signing a 3-year lease with an option for another 3 years. And when the personal guarantee question came up, there was no question. And I asked them, are you okay with the personal guarantee? And he told me, well, I plan to be in business, for 3 years, and I'm going to conduct my business out of here. So why not? And I thought that was such an optimistic answer and that's a true entrepreneurial answer to that question. And to your point, there are ways to negotiate it. And we want to bring up to the audience that since we're demystifying commercial real estate, that all the parts of a letter of intent or a lease are complementary to each other, meaning that everything has to be agreed upon, and all the terms complement each other. So by the time that the conversation of the personal guarantee and the conversation of the security deposit happens, that happens concurrently with the landlord having reviewed the financials of the business, understanding the business plan, understanding whether they have had success elsewhere, understanding their likelihood of success in their center. The landlord is looking for that because they like continuity and they want the continuity of that revenue as well. So they want for obviously the concept to be successful in their center. So a lot of the conversations that surround personal guarantee and security deposits depends on all those other factors. One of the things that you mentioned, I haven't heard of the burn off, but that makes sense. But for me, we would always call it a rolling 1-year guarantee. So, when things got very dicey and we were very close to making a deal, then we would offer this idea that how about we do a rolling 1-year guarantee, meaning that I will guarantee 1 year of the lease and that will continue to roll year over year. Obviously, if I have 6 months left on my lease, and I decide to close shop, then I'm only on the hook for that 6 months. And that's where the rolling year, comes up. But that's a way where you're saying, okay, I'm going to, minimize my exposure and at the same time give the landlord a certain level of guarantee that, if I pay you 1 year's worth of of rent, the likely scenario is that you will, in that time frame, be able to find another tenant and be able to do the build out for the new configuration of the space. And so it kind of becomes a win-win. But again, all of those things need to be negotiated, and a lot depends on supply and demand, because ultimately those are the forces that we have to deal with, whether it is in commercial leasing or sales.
Correct. And then there are companies too that can help, companies like Otso, where they don't necessarily come up with a guarantee to personally guarantee the lease, but they do a significant credit check and financial background check, and they come up with a plan where they're basically saying, and it comes into play more like with big security deposits.
That's right.
But to our point, that maybe by bulking up the security deposit, you could get rid of the personal guarantee. Exactly. So there are ways around the personal guarantee. I just, wanted to bring this up so that we could emphasize that because everything is negotiable, there are workarounds. Now, to your point with your business, if you're solid, if you're rock solid and you know that you're going to do well, or this is your third or fourth opening, you should be able to get rid of that by working with the landlord, right?
Exactly.
So we just didn't want people to think, especially people who are coming across a commercial lease for the first time, whether they're brokers or tenants, to be afraid by it, but they are legally binding documents. Correct. So, don't be intimidated for sure, but know that every part of it is negotiable, and just be, clear on what everything is, and have an attorney review and discuss something that you don't understand with your broker and or your attorney.
No, it's extremely important because, in a lot of ways, especially for people that enter into 5-10 year leases, it's a marriage,
right?
And the lease is the contractual, obligations that both parties have under that marriage. And it's very important to take the time early on, invest the resources that you need to invest to have proper legal representation, because you're going to enter into something that in some cases you may not even deal with. It might be your heirs that have to deal with the decision that you made 10 years prior. I've seen landlords that enter into a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options. Well, the tenant has control for 20 years of that property, and so it better be a good marriage. And, the way to have a good marriage in the relationship between landlord and tenants, to have clear expectations and responsibilities and rights that are enumerated in the lease. And that's where, it becomes a very, very important thing.
And that's a great transition into the second part of a lease, which isn't so common, and it's the early termination clause. And I like to encourage it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to mention another thing about this before we move into that.
Okay.
The landlord has to consider the value of having the personal guarantee. And I just want to share this story. I had a client who we put this freestanding office building for lease. We had a publicly traded company provide an offer. It was going to be a 10-year lease with another 2 5-year options. And the tenant was adamant about, we are a publicly traded company. We do not provide corporate or personal guarantees. That's not how we do it, et cetera, but we're a publicly traded company. And the publicly traded company was something that was repeated over and over again. We saw a lot of red flags from the early goes. And thankfully, my client realized that, hey, this transaction and the lease and the terms that they wanted were just not going to work. And luckily, we found a better fit, a regional company. She got both a corporate and a personal guarantee with the spouse, but more importantly, she got the guarantee of a company that is solid and that she could see has incredible success, and this would have been their 4th location.
Let me ask you about the one that kept saying that they were publicly traded, because I had the same issue. So the one who was publicly traded, was it the publicly traded parent company who was signing the lease, or was it a brand new subsidiary? Because that's what happened to me. It was a publicly traded company, but when they were coming into Florida, it was a brand new corporation, and the person signing the lease, the corporation signing the lease was brand new.
Correct.
So they were trying to use the parents' financials and all that, and my landlord was like, no. We still need some kind of corporate guarantee from the parent.
Correct.
Because you have nothing. You're a brand new entity with signing this lease, or they needed the corporate to sign.
So corporate was going to sign.
Okay.
However, sometimes you have little angels that protect you. To the benefit of my client, we found a better option, for her, and it's worked out extremely well. But 6 months after we signed that lease with the new, tenants, the old tenants that kept saying we're publicly traded, they go into bankruptcy.
Yep.
And so, it's really a crazy thing, and that's why legal advice is so important. But I just wanted to explain to you that's why the personal guarantee is such a sticking point. But again, there are ways to work around at it. But I wanted to give the landlord perspective, which is, hey,
correct.
We want to make sure that people are committed. Also, when people have that much, when you have that guarantee and you're going through, let's say, a bankruptcy restructuring, because you can't really foresee that. But now they're not going to treat every lease the same way. This lease would carry a lot more weight.
Right.
The landlord would have more protection, and so hence that's why it is there. But
and a lot of times the landlord has to ask for it because they have a bank. If they have a bank involved or some kind of financial institution behind them, oftentimes that is required because, again, the loans and the money from both the lender side as well as from the landlord side are based on what their leases are doing. So
absolutely. Well, let's talk about this clause that which is the other side of it.
Right. The other side of it that we don't see so often is the early termination clause. And that is basically a clause saying, okay, this is what we're agreeing to, but should something happen within the period of my initial lease term, I'm going to be able to get out as the tenant, and the landlord is agreeing to letting me out ahead of time. So it's not so common in leases because landlords obviously don't really necessarily want to provide it. But I think it's important because, to your point, if anything does happen down the road, and I've seen this with the landlord who didn't have it, and the tenant just up and left. And so now what do they have to do? They have to file suit. They have to go after him for the personal guarantee. They have to do all that, which is also expensive. And at some point, it's going to be like, it's not worth the money that I'm spending trying to go after the remaining part of the lease. In an early termination, you're giving them out, and you can have both. You can have the personal guarantee and the early termination. And the early termination terms, though, are worked out ahead of time. Now, the tenant doesn't just get to say, I have an early termination, I get a leave. They usually have to pay a percentage of the remaining rent or tenant improvements that were done on behalf of the tenant, or free rent that was given to the tenant, or broker's commissions, etc. So there's usually a percentage, and that percentage also gets stepped down the closer that the tenant gets to fulfilling the lease.
Correct.
And let's be realistic. There are a lot of reasons other than I'm going out of business that a tenant might want to move. If they all of a sudden find themselves in massive expansion mode and they need bigger space or more space, and there's no space within the building, or they didn't have that worked into the lease as well, they might need to get out so that they can move to new space, etc. So that can go into play with other portions within the lease, but it's important to have, because if you are a tenant that does need to break for a legitimate reason, again, to your point of the marriage and clarity and everything being up front, if you know going in and the landlord knows going in that they're going to be covered, at different phases of the lease in case somebody does leave, then they know they don't have to potentially spend all this money, because going after a personal guarantee, you still have to go to court, you still have to file, you still have to do all that kind of stuff. So
I find it interesting that everything in commercial real estate is really about numbers, and that is a calculation that is based on the landlord's ability to recuperate any tenant improvement credits that were provided for the build out, compensation that was paid out to the brokers involved, and some time on the market that they will consider reasonable to be able to find another tenant for the space. I've heard of this clause, and I've heard of people mentioning it or calling it the good guy clause.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And it's like, and so where does the good guy part come in? Well, the good guy part come in is that they're going to cooperate They're going to leave you the keys. They're not going to, damage anything. It's going to be very amicable. You're going to pay the fee that you agreed to pay. You're going to turn over the keys. And so, for that reason, we're going to give you an out. And for the most part, what I have found is that, look, it's not in every case. And of course, it's the most important thing is what's written on a lease, right? It doesn't ever take away from that. But I've seen landlords, especially during times where there are some unforeseen, circumstances, be very reasonable to a large degree. I remember, shortly after the pandemic, this group, it was a good company who was occupying too big of a space, and they had an institutional landlord. It was a REIT. And, they just were good tenants for 5 years. And then all of a sudden, during the pandemic, they ran into some tough times. They had a conversation with the landlord. They had just signed for another 5 years. And the landlord said, look, we'll let you pay, a portion of the rent until you find a smaller space. And, we'll figure it out. And then, of course, they found a space that was half the size, and that the financials said that they could definitely afford. And then the landlord let them out. So, there's, what you don't want to do as a tenant is ever sign a lease with the expectation that, they'll be nice to me if I'm ever in trouble, right? You never want to do that. But I'll give you another example of where I've seen this happen. Sometimes when you have, let's say, a neighborhood shopping center that is anchored by a supermarket, that you have a scenario where there is a level of reporting that the lender is asking the landlord to have. And I remember speaking to this landlord, and they had this requirement where they wanted all of their food and beverage companies, all of the tenants, they wanted them to give them the reporting, a copy of the reporting that they provided to the Florida Department of Revenue for how much revenue they generated and the sales taxes that were sent out to the state. And they kept that year over year. When the pandemic hit and people were telling them, look, I'm really hurting, right? They asked them, okay, send me the report for this year. And then they saw a 20-30%. So then, in order to be good landlords, because they were good tenants and they knew the numbers, they were like, okay, I'm going to adjust commensurate with the loss of revenue.
Right.
And it's only going to be for a short period of time, but then I want new reporting every 6 months, right? And so I found that to be, a really interesting and a very data-based approach, instead of just because they also didn't want to be fooled, right? They didn't want to be in a situation. So I thought that was really interesting. I think this good guy clause, it's a very good thing, and from my experience, there are some landlords that just are not able to do it, right? Because of the things that we mentioned. They might have a lender, they might have other requirements that they have to meet, and then there are those which is more, to me, the single owner that is more amicable to that idea, to say, hey, listen, if things don't work out, we have worked out a term where, okay, you pay me X amount, you can leave, you can exit, you don't have to worry about the guarantee, and then we can part amicably, and I'll put the property back on the market. So it's that, but the question becomes question of negotiation as well, right?
Correct.
So in my mind, the question is about the timing as to when you bring that up. The second thing is, what do you lose by asking for that? Right? Because sometimes people might be afraid of this personal guarantee, like we mentioned it, when they have a very strong business, right?
Right.
And so by not approaching the idea of having an early termination clause, then you might be able to get better terms on the base rent. You may get better terms on the escalations,
More
right?
TI.
More TI. Mm-hmm. So you have to always balance that out. And that has to be part of the conversation that you have with your broker, right? Which is to say, what do I gain and what are my potential gains if I don't approach it from this angle? And I think that that's where, obviously experience comes into play. Just because you want, a set of things, you have to understand that from the mindset of both parties, there are things that they cannot, that are non-negotiable, and then there are things that are negotiable. And sometimes, unfortunately, you end up negotiating the thing that doesn't really add too much value to you, but it might be like a little bit of a safety blanket for you. So psychologically, it might make it all right for you to do the deal. And in that case, hey, listen, you have to do it. But in some cases, you're missing out on an opportunity because you're afraid of that, personal guarantee part
Correct.
of it.
Or from a landlord side, the early termination.
Or from a landlord
side. If you can give it, yeah.
Right. Exactly. It's really interesting that we could actually spend some time on a topic that is just one or two clauses on a lease, and that tells you about the intricacies of commercial leasing. I think we could do multiple episodes just diving into on every clause in the lease.
We'd have to have lots of cafecito for our listeners, though, because leases can be boring and they can be dull, which is why people, I'm always dumbfounded in real estate how people sign contracts without reading them.
Correct.
And I remember being at a closing and the buyer literally sat there and read his entire financial package. And, the lender was there saying, it's what we'd already sent you. You've already seen this. And if you don't sign it, you don't get the loan.
Right.
And we're like, and you're on the hook, right? By the way, you've finished due diligence, it's closing date, but I think people a lot of times think, oh, this is standard. It's kind of like when you get the terms of agreement for downloading an app. It's like, well, if I don't sign it, I don't get the app, right? So and I just want our, users, real estate users to know that these are negotiable. You can still get the property without signing the first thing that comes across your desk. And I know that sounds really, really obvious. And some people are probably going, well, duh, that's common sense. But I can't tell you how many people I know didn't read their lease. They don't understand it. They don't read the contract. Right. And then when I go back and I say, well, yes, you do have to pay utilities. It's in the contract. Oh, I thought they were included. Well, no, So those kind of things.
And can I throw a little tip, because I think, this happens often. Number one, you have to understand that it's not cheap to have an attorney review a lease. And partly is because they carry a certain level of liability by reviewing a lease that they haven't constructed. Usually they prefer to use their lease because they know every aspect of it. They know how one clause relates to another, and then they would rather use that lease and then deal with any changes that are proposed by another attorney. But what I think people make a mistake, to your point, is that so you go to an attorney, he charges X amount of money to review the lease. Some people just expect that, oh, he's going to read it and he's going to tell me what are the pitfalls, or if there's an issue. That's not the best approach, right? Because there might be, obviously, the attorney is going to be able to review and correct any legal issues that are present, but not when it comes to the terms of the deal, right? And so when they don't read the lease, the tip is this: read the lease and highlight the areas that bring you cause for pause or that you don't understand, and then tell them, I want you to review the entire lease, but these are the clauses that I am concerned about, and more importantly, might seem simple, but make sure that the terms that you agreed upon in a letter of intent or in a proposal that was given to you, that it's matching what is on the lease.
Correct.
Right? Because sometimes it could be a Scribner's error, it could be...
A lot of landlords have boilerplate leases and they just plug in the information from an LOI, and if they missed something or the LOI has gone back and forth a couple times, so... Definitely. Or to the point that we're discussing today, if there's a clause in there that you want modified, or there's a clause that isn't in there that you would like added, at least you can have that conversation with your attorney.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, do you have your stat of the episode?
I do. So today, June 20th, is National Smoothie Day.
Ooh.
It is also...
Where's my smoothie?
It's
What's up?
Well, you got to wait till I get to the end of my stat. So it's also National American Eagle Day, and my favorite, National Hike with a Geek Day. So my recommendation for after you listen to this is stop by my favorite place, which is Wayside Marketplace on Red Road in Pinecrest. Get the Elvis smoothie. Go down to the Everglades and take a hike, and maybe you'll find an eagle. How's that?
Wait a minute. I probably didn't hear it correctly. Did you say hike with a geek day?
National Hike with a Geek Day. I do not make these up, people. This is when I googled what is the national significance of June 20th, National Hike with a Geek. And I love to hike, so I guess I'm a hiking geek.
Oh my God. You know what's sad is I know there's got to be a story behind it, and I'm curious, but at the same time I'm not curious. No. Well, I was looking at trying to figure out how many commercial leases are signed in a year in the U.S. That's a tougher thing to find, right? There's no general statistic for that. But what I did find is that there are 3.781 million real estate rental and leasing businesses in the U.S. as of 2023, and that was an increase of 3.4% from 2022. And in the list, California is at the top with 59,000 plus businesses. Florida is second at 39,728 of those businesses. So leasing is big business.
Yes.
And so, that means there's a lot of clauses, being emailed and redlined back and forth daily. I can only imagine those statistics.
For sure. And that was like, now I feel like I have to give a serious one, but I don't have a serious one.
No, not at all. I love your fun one.
But I do want to give a shout out to Otso and
Absolutely.
Just the fact that I brought them up. I think we should interview them because they're amazing. If you're going through leasing negotiations and have an issue with deposits, or you want more of your money to go towards your own tenant improvements and using your capital, Otso is an amazing company.
I don't know if you want to just add that what they do is something really, really interesting, which is that they do the full financial workup of the tenant. And then they come up with basically an insurance policy that the tenant pays for that guarantees X amount to the landlord were they to default on the lease. And that allows the landlord to have the protection, but it also allows the tenant to not have to provide such a large output of liquidity in order to provide a security deposit that is larger than they were expecting. And they have great leadership at Otso and great individuals working there. So we are definitely fans.
Marissa Limsiaco and Josh Feinberg are the founders, and they're amazing people. Follow them on LinkedIn and stay tuned. We are definitely going to have an interview with them.
I love it. Guys, thank you so much for joining us once again. I told you she was an amazing expert in commercial real estate. So without further ado, Jennifer, say bye.
Bye. Hike with a geek.
Yeah, let us know how that goes.